The blizzard had been raging for 3 days when Quincy Ingram spotted the dark shape huddled against a pine tree, nearly buried in snowdrifts that had transformed the Colorado Rockies into a frozen wasteland. It was February 1878, and even for a man who had spent the better part of his 32 years trapping and hunting in these mountains, this was one of the worst storms he'd ever witnessed. The figure wasn't moving, and at first, Quincy thought it might be a fallen deer or an abandoned pack, but something made him dismount from his sturdy bay gelding and trudge through the waist-deep snow to investigate. When he brushed away the crystalline powder from what he'd discovered, his heart lurched in his chest. It was a woman, her lips blue, her face pale as death itself, and she was barely breathing. Without hesitation, Quincy scooped her up into his arms, surprised by how light she felt even through the layers of her frozen traveling clothes. Her head lolled against his chest, and he could feel the faint flutter of her heartbeat through both their heavy coats. He secured her on his horse, mounting behind her to keep her upright, and turned the gelding back toward his cabin. The ride that normally took 15 minutes stretched into nearly an hour as he fought against the howling wind and driving snow, holding the unconscious woman against him, trying to share what little warmth his body could offer. By the time his log cabin came into view through the white curtain of the storm, his arms ached from holding her, but he didn't dare loosen his grip. Inside, the cabin was blessedly warm from the fire he'd banked before heading out that morning to check his trap lines. Quincy laid the woman on the thick bearskin rug in front of the stone fireplace and immediately set about stoking the flames higher. Her clothes were soaked through, frozen in places, and he knew he had to get her out of them, or she'd never warm up. His hands trembled slightly as he worked, not from the cold but from the strange protectiveness he already felt toward this stranger. He was careful and respectful as he removed her wet garments, averting his eyes as much as possible, replacing them with his own dry long underwear and woolen socks that were far too large for her slender frame. He wrapped her in every blanket he owned, then pulled his own sleeping pallet closer to the fire and settled her on it. For the next several hours, Quincy kept vigil beside her, periodically checking her breathing and her pulse, adding wood to the fire, heating water, and preparing warm compresses for her frozen hands and feet. He'd seen frostbite before, had lost 2 fingers on his left hand to it himself when he was younger and more foolish. Her fingers and toes were dangerously pale, but he thought he'd found her in time. As night fell and the storm continued its assault on the mountain, she finally began to stir. Her eyelids fluttered and she made a small sound of confusion. "Easy now," Quincy said quietly, his voice rough from disuse. He lived alone up here and sometimes went weeks without speaking to another soul. "You're safe. You were caught in the storm." Her eyes opened fully then, and Quincy found himself staring into the most striking green eyes he'd ever seen. They were the color of new spring grass, bright and alive despite her ordeal. She looked around the cabin with growing alarm, her gaze finally settling back on him. "Who are you?" "Where am I?" Her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "Name's Quincy Ingram. You're in my cabin about 10 miles northwest of Reno, Colorado. Found you nearly frozen to death out by Eagle Ridge. Been unconscious for the better part of 6 hours." She tried to sit up, then seemed to realize she was wearing unfamiliar clothes. A flush crept across her pale cheeks. "My clothes were frozen solid. Had to get you out of them or you'd have died. I was respectful about it, I promise you that. They're drying over there." He gestured to where he'd hung her garments on a line he'd strung near the fire. She pulled the blankets tighter around herself, studying him with those remarkable eyes. Despite the awkwardness of the situation, Quincy felt no fear from her, only curiosity. "Thank you," she said finally. "I thought I was going to die out there. I think I might have if you hadn't found me. What were you doing out in a storm like this anyway? This isn't weather for anyone to be traveling in, let alone a woman alone." A shadow passed over her face and she looked away. "I was running away." Quincy waited, sensing there was more to the story, but he didn't press. He'd learned in his years alone in the mountains that silence often drew out more truth than questions ever could. After a long moment, she continued, "My name is Lillian Walsh. I was supposed to marry a man in Denver, a banker my father arranged for me to wed. I'd never met him, but my father said it was a good match, that I should be grateful. When I arrived in Denver 3 weeks ago and met him, I discovered he was cruel. He struck me during our first dinner together because I spoke without being addressed. Said he needed to teach me proper manners before we wed." Quincy's jaw tightened, but he kept his expression neutral. "So you ran." "I took a stage headed west, got off in Reno, thinking I could find work there. But the town was smaller than I expected, and word travels fast. Someone recognized me from a telegram my father had sent. The sheriff was going to send me back. So I bought a horse, foolishly thinking I could ride to California, maybe San Francisco, where I could disappear. I'd only made it a few hours from town when the storm hit. My horse threw me and ran off. I tried to walk back, but I got turned around in the snow." "You're lucky to be alive," Quincy said, shaking his head. "These mountains don't forgive mistakes, especially in winter." "I know that now." She met his eyes again, and there was a determination in them that stirred something in Quincy's chest. "But I'd rather have died out there than go back to that life." They sat in silence for a while, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the wind howling outside. Quincy heated some of the rabbit stew he'd made the day before and brought her a bowl. She accepted it gratefully, and he noticed her hands were steadier as she ate. The color was returning to her face, and her fingers, while still pale, no longer had that deathly white appearance. "The storm's not going to let up for at least another day, maybe two," Quincy said. "You're welcome to stay here until it passes and you're strong enough to travel. After that, well, we'll figure something out." "You're very kind," Lillian said softly. "I don't deserve such kindness from a stranger." "Everyone deserves kindness, Miss Walsh. It's just in short supply sometimes." That first night, Quincy gave her his sleeping pallet by the fire and made himself a bed on the other side of the room, though he didn't sleep much. He kept the fire going and found himself watching over her, this unexpected visitor who had stumbled into his solitary life. When morning came, the storm was still raging, and he realized they might be snowed in for even longer than he'd anticipated. Over the next few days, as the blizzard continued its relentless assault, Quincy and Lillian settled into an awkward but oddly comfortable routine. She was stronger each day, insisting on helping with tasks around the cabin despite his protests. She learned to feed the fire, to cook on his iron stove, to mend the small tears in his clothes with surprising skill. They talked, carefully at first, sharing small details about their lives. Quincy told her about growing up in Kentucky, how his parents had died of fever when he was 16, leaving him alone. He drifted west, working odd jobs, until he discovered he preferred the company of mountains and solitude to the noise and complication of towns and cities. He'd been living in this cabin for 8 years, trapping in the winter, hunting and gathering in the summer, trading his furs in Reno a few times a year for the supplies he couldn't make or grow himself. Lillian spoke of her life in Boston, where she'd grown up the daughter of a textile merchant who'd made his fortune selling cloth to the Union Army during the war. Her mother had died giving birth to her younger brother, who'd survived only a few days himself. Her father had never recovered from the loss, throwing himself into his work and drinking. when business reverses had cost him nearly everything. He'd seen Lillian as his way to restore his fortune, arranging her marriage to the Denver banker who'd offered to settle his debts in exchange for a young, cultured wife. "I was just a commodity to him," Lillian said one evening as they sat by the fire, the storm still howling outside. "Something to be traded for money. I don't think he ever really saw me as his daughter." "That's a hard thing," Quincy replied. "Parents are supposed to protect their children, not sell them." "Did you ever think about marrying?" Lillian asked, changing the subject. "Having a family." Quincy was quiet for a moment, staring into the flames. "Thought about it once or twice. There was a girl in Reno a few years back. Storekeeper's daughter. We stepped out together for a while, but she wanted a man who'd live in town, have a regular job. Couldn't picture myself behind a counter or working in a mine. Couldn't ask her to live up here either. It's a hard life, especially for a woman, so we parted ways." "Do you regret it?" "Sometimes. Gets lonely up here, especially in winter. But I never wanted to change who I was just to fit into someone else's idea of what I should be." Lillian smiled, a real smile that transformed her face. "I understand that more than you know." On the fourth day, the storm finally broke. Quincy opened the cabin door to reveal a world transformed by snow, everything white and pristine and breathtakingly beautiful in the clear morning sunlight. The drifts were higher than his head in places, and he knew it would be days before the trails were passable enough for Lillian to travel safely. They fell into new rhythms together. Quincy taught Lillian how to snowshoe, and they made trips out to check his trap lines together. He showed her how to read the signs of the forest, how to identify animal tracks, how to move quietly through the woods. She was a quick learner, with a sharp mind and a willingness to try anything. In return, she brought a different kind of knowledge to the cabin. She could read and write far better than he could, and in the evenings, she read to him from the few books he owned, her voice filling the cabin with stories of far-off places and grand adventures. Quincy found himself looking forward to these evenings more than he cared to admit. The way the firelight played across Lillian's face as she read, the sound of her laughter when he told her stories about his various misadventures in the mountains, the comfortable silences they could share while working side by side. It all felt dangerously right. He tried to remind himself that she was only here temporarily, that once the snow melted enough, she'd go on her way to California or wherever else she chose. But his heart wasn't listening to his head anymore. Lillian, for her part, was experiencing her own internal struggle. She'd never known a man like Quincy. He was strong and capable, yes, but also gentle and thoughtful. He never raised his voice, never made her feel small or stupid, never tried to control her. He treated her as an equal, asking her opinion, teaching her skills without condescension, trusting her to handle herself. And there was something about the way he looked at her sometimes, when he thought she wasn't watching, that made her heart race. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after he'd found her, they were returning from checking the traps when Lillian's snowshoe caught on a hidden branch. She pitched forward, and Quincy caught her before she could fall. For a moment they stood frozen, his arms around her waist, her hands on his chest, their faces inches apart. The air between them seemed to crackle with possibility. "Are you all right?" Quincy asked, his voice rougher than usual. "Yes," Lillian whispered, but she didn't pull away, and neither did he. They stood like that for several heartbeats, the winter sun warm on their faces, the forest silent around them. Then, slowly, carefully, Quincy lowered his head and kissed her. It was a gentle kiss, tentative and sweet, asking a question rather than demanding an answer. Lillian responded without hesitation, her arms sliding around his neck, kissing him back with a passion that surprised them both. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. "I've wanted to do that for days," Quincy admitted. "I've wanted you to," Lillian replied, then laughed at the stunned expression on his face. "Did you think I hadn't noticed the way you look at me? Or the way I look at you? I thought maybe I was imagining it. You're a lady from Boston, educated and cultured. I'm just a mountain man who can barely write his own name." Lillian cupped his face in her mittened hands. "You're the finest man I've ever known, Quincy Ingram. You saved my life, yes, but more than that. You've shown me what it means to be truly free, to live on your own terms. You've treated me with more respect and kindness than any so-called gentleman ever did." They kissed again, longer this time, and by the time they made it back to the cabin, everything had changed between them. That night, Lillian moved her bedding next to Quincy's, and they lay together by the fire, talking and kissing and making plans for a future that suddenly seemed possible. "Stay with me," Quincy said as they watched the fire burn low. "I know it's a hard life up here and I can't offer you much, but I can offer you freedom and love and a partnership between equals. Stay with me, Lillian." "Yes," she said simply. "There's nowhere else I'd rather be." But as winter slowly gave way to early spring, they both knew they had practical matters to address. Lillian was still technically engaged to the banker in Denver, and her father might still be looking for her. They needed to make things right, or at least as right as they could, before they could truly build a life together. In late March, when the snow had melted enough to make the journey possible, they rode together down to Reno. The town was small, just a collection of buildings clustered along the creek, with a general store, a saloon, a hotel, and a few other establishments. The sheriff, a grizzled man named Tom Hendricks, recognized Lillian immediately. "Miss Walsh," he said, his hand moving toward his gun belt. "Your father's been looking for you, sent several telegrams. He's mighty worried." "I'm sure he's worried about his business arrangement," Lillian said coolly. "But I'm not going back, Sheriff. I'm 22 years old and I have the right to make my own choices." "The law says you're a runaway bride," Hendricks replied, though he didn't draw his weapon. "Breach of promise is a serious matter." "The law also says a woman can't be forced into marriage against her will," Quincy interjected, stepping up beside Lillian. "And she was struck by the man she was supposed to marry. That makes the contract void, doesn't it?" The sheriff looked between them, his expression thoughtful. "You two together now?" "We are," Quincy confirmed. "And we plan to marry with or without anyone's blessing." Hendricks sighed, removing his hat to scratch his head. "Look, I'm not in the business of forcing women to marry men who beat them, but this is going to cause complications. That banker in Denver has connections, and Miss Walsh's father has been persistent." "What if I sent a telegram to my father," Lillian suggested, "telling him I'm alive and well, but that I won't be honoring the arrangement? And another to the banker, releasing him from the engagement?" "You'd need to pay back the dowry your father received," Hendricks pointed out. "I don't have any money," Lillian admitted. Quincy had been thinking about this. "I've got furs stored up, 8 years' worth that I haven't sold. I was saving them, didn't have much use for the money up here, but they're worth something. What if we sold them, sent the money to settle the debt?" Over the next few days, they worked out the details. Quincy's furs were indeed valuable, enough to cover the dowry and leave them with a small amount left over. Lillian composed careful telegrams to both her father and the banker, making it clear that she would not be returning and that the debt was paid. The banker, it turned out, was more relieved than angry. He'd apparently been having second thoughts about marrying a woman who'd rather brave a blizzard than become his wife. Her father's response was less gracious, but it didn't matter. He disowned her via telegram, which hurt Lillian more than she wanted to admit, but she had Quincy, and that was enough. The local preacher, A kind man named Reverend Matthews agreed to marry them in early April. They stood in the small church in Reno with Sheriff Hendricks and the storekeeper's wife as witnesses, and pledged their lives to each other. Lillian wore a simple dress she'd bought with some of their remaining money, and Quincy had cleaned up as best he could, his beard trimmed, his hair washed and combed back. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, and Quincy kissed his bride, he felt a completeness he'd never known before. They spent their wedding night at the hotel in Reno, a luxury they both appreciated after months of sleeping on the floor of the cabin. But they were both eager to return to the mountain, to their home. They used the last of their money to buy supplies, including things that would make Lillian's life easier: better cooking implements, fabric for making clothes and curtains, seeds for starting a garden come summer, and a few books. Back at the cabin, they settled into married life with surprising ease. Quincy built onto the cabin, adding a separate bedroom and a larger area for storage. Lillian started her garden, coaxing vegetables from the mountain soil. They worked together on everything, from tanning hides to preserving food for the coming winter. The physical relationship between them was passionate and tender, a discovery of each other that deepened their emotional bond. As summer bloomed across the mountains, Lillian realized she was pregnant. She told Quincy one evening in June as they sat outside the cabin watching the sunset paint the peaks gold and pink. He was quiet for a long moment, and she worried he might be upset, but when he turned to her, there were tears in his eyes. "A baby," he said wonderingly. "Our baby. Are you happy?" She asked. "Happier than I ever thought possible," he replied, pulling her close. "You've given me everything, Lillian. Love, companionship, purpose, and now a child. I don't have the words to tell you what that means to me." They spent the summer preparing for the baby's arrival. Quincy built a cradle from pine wood, sanding it smooth and carving small animals into the headboard. Lillian sewed tiny clothes and blankets. They talked for hours about what kind of parents they wanted to be, about the values they wanted to instill in their child, about the life they were building together. In November, when the first snows were beginning to fall again, Lillian went into labor. Quincy had ridden down to Reno a month earlier to ask the doctor there for advice, since there was no way to get help up to the cabin once winter set in. Dr. Patterson had given him detailed instructions and a medical kit, and Quincy had studied everything carefully, praying he wouldn't need it. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day. Quincy stayed by Lillian's side the entire time, holding her hand, helping her breathe through the contractions, trying to hide his own terror at the possibility of losing her. But Lillian was strong, stronger than either of them had known, and when their son finally came into the world with a lusty cry, Quincy wept with relief and joy. They named him Samuel, after Quincy's father. He was a healthy baby with Lillian's green eyes and a shock of dark hair. Holding his son for the first time, Quincy felt a fierce protectiveness that eclipsed anything he'd ever experienced. This was his family, this woman and this child, and he would do anything to keep them safe and happy. The winter was harder with a baby, but also infinitely richer. The cabin that had once been so silent now rang with Samuel's cries and gurgles, with Lillian's lullabies, with the sounds of family life. Quincy found himself working harder than ever, hunting and trapping to ensure they had enough food and furs to trade for necessities, but he never resented it. Every moment of effort was for them, for this life they'd built together. As Samuel grew from infant to toddler, Quincy and Lillian's love deepened and matured. They had their disagreements, of course. Lillian sometimes missed the cultural life she'd known in Boston, the concerts and theater and stimulating conversation. Quincy occasionally chafed at having to consider others in decisions that he'd once made alone. But they learned to talk through their differences, to compromise, to remember why they'd chosen each other in the first place. When Samuel was 2, Lillian became pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, and when their daughter was born in the spring of 1881, it was a quicker labor. They named her Rose, because she was born when the wild roses were blooming across the mountain meadows. She was a beautiful baby, with Quincy's brown eyes and Lillian's delicate features. The cabin grew more crowded, but Quincy added on again, building a loft where the children could sleep as they grew older. Lillian taught both children to read from an early age, using the precious books they had and making up stories to supplement them. Quincy taught them about the forest, about respecting nature, about self-reliance and courage. When Samuel was 5 and Rose was 3, they made the decision to send Samuel to school in Reno during the school year. It was a wrenching choice, separating the family, but they both felt education was important. They arranged for Samuel to board with the storekeeper and his wife during the week, coming home on weekends when weather permitted. It was hard on all of them, but Samuel thrived, learning to read and write and cipher beyond what Lillian could teach him at home. The years passed in a rhythm of seasons. Winters were for trapping and staying close to the cabin, telling stories around the fire, teaching the children skills they'd need to survive. Springs were for planting and hunting, for watching the world come alive again after the long cold. Summers were for preserving food, for taking the children on long hikes to teach them about the land, for picnics by the creek that ran behind their cabin. Autumns were for harvest and preparation, for gathering what they'd need to survive the coming winter. Through it all, Quincy and Lillian's love remained the foundation of their family. They still made time for each other, still found moments to be alone together, to remember the passion that had first drawn them together. Quincy still looked at Lillian sometimes with wonder that she'd chosen this life, chosen him. Lillian still felt a thrill when Quincy came through the door after a day in the woods, still loved the strength and gentleness in his hands, still trusted him with her whole heart. They faced challenges, certainly. There was the winter when they all came down with influenza and Quincy had to make the dangerous journey to Reno in a blizzard to get medicine. There was the summer when a bear got into their food stores and they had to rebuild everything. There was the spring when Samuel fell from a tree and broke his arm, and Lillian had to set it herself because they couldn't get to the doctor in time. But they faced every challenge together, and each one overcome made them stronger. By the time Samuel was 10 and Rose was 8, the cabin had become a real homestead. Quincy had cleared more land for a larger garden and a small field where they grew hay for the 2 horses they now owned. They had chickens for eggs and meat, and a milk cow that Lillian had insisted on getting despite Quincy's doubts. She'd been right, though. The fresh milk and butter made a huge difference in their diet. They'd also become more integrated into the small community around Reno. Quincy still wasn't comfortable in town, but he'd developed friendships with some of the other trappers and hunters. Lillian had become known for her healing skills, having learned much from Dr. Patterson over the years. People would sometimes make the journey up to the cabin to ask for her help with illnesses or injuries, and she never turned anyone away. One day in the fall of 1886, a young woman arrived at their cabin, half frozen and desperate, just as Lillian had been 8 years earlier. She was running from an abusive husband, she said, and had nowhere else to go. Quincy and Lillian took her in without hesitation, gave her shelter and food, and helped her get safely to her sister's home in California. The young woman cried when she thanked them, saying they'd saved her life. After she left, Quincy pulled Lillian close. "I think about that day I found you in the snow," he said. "How different my life would be if I'd turned back earlier, if I'd missed seeing you there. It terrifies me, thinking about how close I came to losing you before I ever knew you." "But you didn't miss me," Lillian replied, kissing him softly. "You found me, and you saved me, and you loved me, and I loved you back. That's what matters." "You saved me too, you know," Quincy said. "I didn't even know how lonely I was until you filled up all those empty spaces in my life." They held each other as the sun set behind the mountains, still as in love as they'd been that first winter, perhaps even more so. Love that had weathered hardship and grown deeper with time. When Samuel turned 15, he announced that he wanted to become a doctor. He'd been working with Dr. Patterson during his time in Reno, helping with patients, learning everything he could. The old doctor had told him he had a gift for healing and should pursue formal medical training. It would mean leaving Colorado, going back east to one of the medical colleges there. It would be expensive and difficult, but Quincy and Lillian were determined to make it happen. They sold off most of their trap lines, keeping only a few close to the cabin. Quincy took on work guiding hunting parties through the mountains, something he'd resisted for years, but which paid better than trapping. Lillian sold her preserves and remedies in town. Slowly, they saved enough to send Samuel to school. The day he left for Chicago to attend Rush Medical College was one of the hardest of their lives. Quincy shook his son's hand, then pulled him into a fierce embrace. "Make us proud, son. But more importantly, make yourself proud. Be a good man, a kind man." "I learned from the best," Samuel replied, his voice thick with emotion. Lillian held him last, this boy who'd made her a mother, who'd been born in this cabin, who was now a young man ready to take on the world. "Write to us," she said. "Tell us everything. And remember, this will always be your home, no matter where life takes you." With Samuel gone, the cabin felt emptier, but Rose was growing into a remarkable young woman. She had her mother's intelligence and her father's love of the wilderness. She could track as well as Quincy, shoot straighter than most men, and had a way with animals that was almost magical. She also inherited her mother's healing touch and often accompanied Lillian when she was called to help someone. In 1890, when Rose was 13, disaster struck. A late spring snowstorm trapped a group of settlers on the mountain pass. Quincy, now 54 but still strong and capable, led the rescue effort. They saved most of the settlers, but Quincy came down with pneumonia from the exposure. For 2 terrifying weeks, he fought for his life while Lillian and Rose nursed him day and night. Dr. Patterson came up to the cabin, though the journey was hard on his aging bones. "He's strong," the doctor told Lillian. "If anyone can pull through this, it's Quincy, but you need to be prepared." Pneumonia at his age is serious. Lillian refused to accept the possibility of losing him. She sat by his bedside, talking to him even when he was delirious with fever, reminding him of everything they still had to do together, all the years they still had ahead of them. Rose helped, making the poultices and teas that might help, praying in her own way to whatever powers governed life and death in these mountains. And Quincy did pull through. Slowly, painfully, but he recovered. When he was finally strong enough to sit up and take solid food, he reached for Lillian's hand. "Thought I might be leaving you," he said. "I wouldn't let you," Lillian replied fiercely. "We made a promise, Quincy Ingram, to grow old together. I intend to hold you to it." He smiled, that warm smile she loved so much. "Yes, madam, I intend to keep that promise." His recovery was slow, and he was never quite as strong as he'd been before, but he adapted. He did less of the heavy work, teaching Rose to take over many of his tasks. She was capable and eager to learn, and Quincy felt a deep pride watching her master the skills he taught her. Letters came regularly from Samuel in Chicago. He was excelling in his studies, top of his class, and working at a hospital where he was gaining invaluable experience. He wrote about the city, about the marvels he'd seen, but also about how much he missed the mountains, missed the clean air and the quiet, missed his family. He promised to come home once he finished his training. In 1894, true to his word, Samuel returned. He was 23 now, a grown man with a medical degree and a wealth of knowledge. But more surprisingly, he brought someone with him, a young woman named Clara, also a doctor, one of the few women to have graduated from a medical college. They'd met during their training and had fallen in love. Clara was from New York, educated and progressive, and when Samuel told her about his family and the mountains, she'd insisted on coming to meet them. Quincy and Lillian liked her immediately. She was warm and intelligent, with a quick wit and a genuine interest in the mountain remedies Lillian had developed over the years. She and Rose became fast friends, with Rose showing Clara all her favorite places in the mountains. Samuel and Clara were married that summer in the meadow behind the cabin, with wildflowers blooming all around and the peaks standing witness. It was a simple ceremony, but beautiful, with Reverend Matthews making the journey from Reno to officiate. Quincy stood beside his son, thinking about his own wedding day nearly 17 years earlier, marveling at how much had changed, how much had stayed the same. After the wedding, Samuel and Clara announced their plans. They were going to open a medical practice in Reno, serving the people of the area who often went without proper medical care. Dr. Patterson was retiring, and he'd offered to sell them his practice and equipment for a reasonable price. It meant Samuel would be close by, would be able to visit regularly, and that meant everything to Quincy and Lillian. As the years rolled on, the family grew. Samuel and Clara had 3 children of their own. Rose eventually married a forest ranger named James Turner, a good man who loved the mountains as much as she did. They built a cabin not far from Quincy and Lillian's, and Rose continued to help her mother with healing work while raising her own family. Quincy and Lillian became grandparents, then great-grandparents. Their cabin was often full of children's laughter, of family gatherings, of the warmth and chaos of a large, loving family. But they still made time for each other, still took walks through the forest they both loved, still sat by the fire in the evenings talking about everything and nothing. On their 20th wedding anniversary, in April 1899, Quincy surprised Lillian with a gift. He'd carved a beautiful wooden box, inlaid with different types of wood to create a mountain scene. Inside, he'd placed a letter, written in his careful, still slightly uncertain hand. Lillian read it with tears streaming down her face. In it, Quincy poured out everything he felt, everything he sometimes struggled to say out loud. He wrote about finding her in the snow, about that moment when he'd brushed away the powder and seen her face for the first time. He wrote about falling in love with her, slowly and then all at once, about how she'd transformed his solitary existence into a life full of meaning and joy. He wrote about their children, their grandchildren, the family they'd built together. And he wrote about his gratitude for every day, every moment, every breath they'd shared. 20 years ago, I thought I knew what my life was, he'd written. I thought I was content with solitude and silence, but you showed me what life could really be. You are my heart, Lillian, my home, my everything. I love you more today than I did on our wedding day, and I'll love you more tomorrow than I do today. However long we have, it will never be enough. Quincy, Lillian whispered, holding the letter to her chest. It's beautiful. You're beautiful. I meant every word, he said, taking her hands in his. Every single word. They danced that night there in their cabin to music only they could hear, swaying together in the firelight, celebrating 20 years of love and partnership and shared life. The new century brought changes. Automobiles began appearing in Reno, though they were rare and impractical in the mountains. The railroad expanded, bringing more people west. The world was modernizing, moving faster, but up in their mountain cabin, Quincy and Lillian's life maintained its steady rhythm. In 1903, Quincy turned 67. His hair was white now, his face deeply lined from years in the mountain sun and wind, but his eyes were still bright, still warm when they looked at Lillian. She was 63, her own hair more silver than brown, but still beautiful, still the woman who'd captured his heart that long-ago winter. They were sitting on the porch one evening in late summer, watching the sunset when Lillian turned to him. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "This life we chose. Sometimes I wonder if you might have been happier staying alone, staying free." Quincy looked at her with such love that it took her breath away. "Not for a single moment," he said firmly. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Lillian. This life we've built, this family, it's more than I ever dreamed of. I was never truly free until I met you. You freed me from loneliness, from emptiness, from just existing instead of really living." "I feel the same way," Lillian said softly. "That blizzard, getting lost in the snow, it was the most terrifying experience of my life. But it brought me to you. It brought me home. I've never regretted staying, not once. We've been blessed," Quincy said, pulling her close. "More blessed than we deserved." They sat together as the light faded from the sky, as the stars began to appear overhead, as they'd done countless times over the years. Around them, the mountains stood eternal, witnesses to their love, shelter for the life they'd created together. In the spring of 1905, Quincy's health began to decline more noticeably. He tired more easily, his breathing sometimes labored. Samuel, visiting from Reno, examined his father carefully and pulled Lillian aside afterward. "His heart is failing," Samuel said gently. "I'm sorry, Ma. It's just age, really. He's lived a good, long life, worked hard, been strong, but hearts wear out just like everything else." "How long?" Lillian asked, her voice steady despite the fear clutching at her chest. "I don't know. Could be months, could be years. But you should both know. Should have time to prepare." Lillian thanked him and sent him home to his own family. Then she went to Quincy, who was resting on their bed. She lay down beside him, fitting herself against his side the way she had for nearly 30 years. "I heard what Samuel told you," Quincy said quietly. "I'm sorry, Lily." She hadn't heard him use that nickname in years. It made her smile even as tears threatened. "Don't you dare apologize for something that's not your fault," she said. "We've known this day would come eventually. We've been lucky to have as much time as we've had." "I don't want to leave you," he said, his voice breaking. "Then stay as long as you can," she replied, taking his hand. "Fight for every day, every hour. I'm not ready to let you go yet," and he did fight. For another year, Quincy held on, growing weaker gradually but still present, still himself. They talked about everything during that year, reminiscing about their life together, about the children, about all the moments that had mattered. They said all the things people often leave unsaid, ensuring there would be no regrets. The family visited often. Samuel and Clara came every week, sometimes bringing the children. Rose was there nearly every day, helping care for her father, learning from her mother how to face loss with grace. The grandchildren came, sitting by Quincy's bed to hear his stories, to hold his weathered hand, to say goodbye in the way children do, with love and confusion and tears. In the early summer of 1906, Quincy took a turn for the worse. Samuel stayed at the cabin and the family gathered. Quincy was lucid, peaceful, ready. "No regrets," he told them all. "Not a single one. I've lived a full life, a good life. I found love when I didn't even know I was looking for it. I had children who made me proud every single day. I've been blessed beyond measure." That night, alone with Lillian for a few moments while the others rested, Quincy squeezed her hand. "Remember that day I found you in the snow? Every detail," Lillian said, tears streaming down her face. "Best day of my life," Quincy whispered. "Led to every other best day. Led to you, to us, to everything that mattered." "I love you, Quincy Ingram," Lillian said. "I've loved you from the moment I woke up in this cabin and saw you sitting by the fire, keeping watch over me. I'll love you until the day I die, and beyond that if such things are possible." "I know," he said, his voice fading. "I've always known. And I love you, Lillian. Always have, always will." He died just before dawn, peacefully, with Lillian holding his hand and his family surrounding him. The mountain man who'd lived so much of his life alone left the world surrounded by love, by the family he and Lillian had created together. They buried him in the meadow behind the cabin, where he'd married his son, where he'd taught his children to track and hunt, where he'd walked with Lillian countless times over the years. The whole community came to pay their respects. People told stories about Quincy, about his kindness, his integrity, his skill in the wilderness, the way he'd always helped anyone who needed it. After everyone left, Lillian stood alone by the grave, looking out at the mountains Quincy had loved so much. She felt empty, hollowed out, but also strangely at peace. They'd had 30 years together, 30 years of love and partnership and shared life. Many people lived entire lifetimes without experiencing what they'd had. Rose came to stand beside her mother. "What will you do now?" she asked gently. "I'll stay," Lillian said simply. "This is my home. He's here in every corner of this cabin, in every tree in this forest. I couldn't leave if I wanted to." And she did stay. For another 12 years, Lillian lived in the cabin she'd shared with Quincy. She continued her healing work, helping people from all over the area. She was there for the births of more grandchildren and great-grandchildren, for weddings and celebrations, a matriarch holding the family together. She walked in the forest every day, talking to Quincy as if he were still beside her, telling him about their family, about the changes in the world, about how much she missed him. Sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, she could almost feel his presence, could almost hear his voice in the wind through the pines. Samuel tried several times to convince her to move to Reno, where she'd be closer to medical care, where she wouldn't be alone. But Lillian refused. "I'm not alone," she'd say. "I have my memories, and I have these mountains, and I have all of you when you visit. That's enough." In the spring of 1918, Lillian fell ill. She was 82 years old, and she knew her time had come. Samuel wanted to take her to the hospital, but she refused that too. "I want to die here," she said. "Where I lived, where I loved, where he is." The family gathered again, just as they had for Quincy. Rose stayed by her mother's side, holding her hand, thanking her for everything she'd taught her, everything she'd been. "Tell me about the blizzard again," Rose asked on what would be Lillian's last night. "Tell me about how Papa found you." So Lillian told the story one more time, her voice weak but clear. She spoke about the cold, about thinking she was going to die, about waking up in the cabin to see Quincy's kind face. She spoke about falling in love, about choosing to stay, about building a life in these mountains. "He saved my life," Lillian said. "But more than that, he gave me a life worth living. He showed me what love really means, what partnership really means. Every day with him was a gift." "He'd say the same about you," Rose said softly. "I know," Lillian smiled. "We saved each other, really. That's what love does. It saves us from loneliness, from emptiness, from going through life alone." As dawn broke over the mountains, painting the peaks in shades of gold and rose, Lillian Walsh Ingram took her last breath, a smile on her face, her family around her, ready to rejoin the man she'd loved for 40 years. They buried her beside Quincy in the meadow, under the vast mountain sky they'd both loved. At the funeral, Samuel spoke about his parents, about the love that had defined their lives and shaped their family. They found each other against all odds, he said. A mountain man and a Boston lady, brought together by a blizzard and bound together by love. They built a life from nothing, created a family, made a home in the wilderness. And they showed all of us what love should be: equal, respectful, passionate, enduring. They're together again now, and I like to think they're walking in some celestial forest, hand in hand, the way they always did here. The cabin remained in the family, passed down through generations, a testament to the love of two people who'd found each other in a snowstorm and built a forever that truly lasted. The story of Quincy and Lillian became family legend, told and retold, inspiring generation after generation to believe in love, to fight for it, to cherish it when they found it. And sometimes, on quiet winter evenings, when the snow falls soft on the mountain and the fire burns warm in the hearth, those who stay in the old cabin swear they can feel a presence, warm and loving, a reminder of the mountain man who found a woman lost in the snow and warmed her by the fire and his side forever, and the woman who chose to stay and build a life more beautiful than any she'd left behind. Their love had transformed them both, had created something lasting and true. Proof that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with the most unexpected encounters, and the deepest love can bloom in the wildest places.